"You might want to rethink this," Naomi Carter said, her voice steady enough to cut through the cold night air, and for a split second, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Red and blue lights pulsed against the siding of her small two-story home, washing the quiet neighborhood in restless color. 30 patrol cars lined bumper to bumper along the curb, engines idling low like something waiting to happen, officers stepping out one by one, boots hitting pavement in a rhythm that didn't belong to a place like this, a place where porch lights usually meant someone was expecting company, not a coordinated show of force. Naomi stood in the doorway, barefoot on worn wooden boards, the screen door creaking softly behind her as it swayed, her hand resting lightly against the frame as if grounding herself, not in fear, but in something older, something practiced, her eyes moving slowly across the line of uniforms without flinching, without rushing, taking in every detail the way someone does when they've learned that what you notice first might matter later. Across the yard, Sheriff Luke Harrington stepped forward, his silhouette sharp under the flood of headlights, hat low, jaw set, the kind of posture that didn't ask questions, only expected compliance, and the deputies behind him followed that lead without hesitation, hands resting near radios, near belts, near authority they wore like second skin. "Ma'am, step outside," he called, voice controlled, not loud, but carrying, the kind of tone that assumed the outcome before the conversation even began. Naomi didn't move right away. Inside the house, a faint light flickered from the living room, casting a soft amber glow that contrasted with the harsh strobes outside, and somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked, a quiet reminder that this wasn't just a structure. It was a life, layered in routines and care and the kind of quiet work no one ever noticed. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly against the doorframe, then relaxed, her shoulders rising with a slow breath before she stepped forward onto the porch, the wood cool beneath her feet, the night air brushing against her skin, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. She looked at Harrington, really looked at him, not as a title, not as a badge, but as a man making a choice in real time, and something in her gaze made. One of the deputies shifted his weight, just barely, like the ground under him wasn't as solid as it had been a moment ago. "This is unnecessary," Naomi said, not pleading, not arguing, just stating it the way someone states a fact they already understand won't be accepted. Harrington's expression didn't change, but the line of his mouth tightened, a small adjustment that spoke louder than any raised voice, and he gestured once, sharp, efficient. The officers spread slightly, forming a wider arc around the property, not chaotic, not aggressive, just deliberate, as if they were following a script written long before they arrived. Naomi's eyes flicked briefly toward the street, catching the reflection of her own home in the windshield of a cruiser, distorted by the curve of glass, lights bending across it, and for a moment, it looked like someone else's life entirely. She exhaled slowly, then reached into the pocket of her loose gray sweatshirt, her movements calm, unhurried, pulling out her phone with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't panic, it was protocol, her thumb hovering over the screen for a fraction of a second before she pressed a contact without looking down, bringing the phone to her ear as the distant hum of connection replaced the noise of the street in her mind. Harrington watched, eyes narrowing slightly, not yet concerned, but no longer dismissive, and the officers closest to him exchanged quick glances, subtle, almost imperceptible, the kind that pass between people when something doesn't fit the pattern they expected. Naomi stood there, framed by her own front door, lights flashing around her, 30 officers waiting. The night stretched tight between action and consequence, and as the call connected, her voice remained level, almost quiet, but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "This is Naomi Carter," she said into the phone, every word precise, deliberate, leaving no room for doubt. "I believe there's been a mistake." The line stayed quiet for half a second, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle in, and Naomi Carter did not blink as the faint voice on the other end acknowledged her name with a level of recognition that did not belong to an ordinary call, her posture unchanged as the distant hum of police radios continued to ripple across the yard, the glow of rotating lights reflecting off her calm expression, as if trying and failing to shake it. She had always been the kind of woman people overlooked, the kind who moved through hospital corridors at 3 in the morning with steady hands and soft steps, checking monitors, adjusting blankets, offering quiet reassurances to patients who barely remembered her name. Her life built on routines that required patience, discipline, and the ability to remain composed when others could not. Neighbors knew her as the one who brought groceries to Mrs. Langley down the street, the one who fixed a broken mailbox without asking for help, the one who kept her porch light on just a little longer than necessary. But no one knew about the framed certificate tucked away in a drawer upstairs, or the old duffel bag pushed to the back of a closet that had not been opened in years. Naomi listened, her eyes still on Sheriff Harrington, as if the conversation in her ear and the scene in front of her were two separate worlds she was holding together by will alone. And when she spoke again, her tone did not rise, did not harden. It simply carried a clarity that made one of the deputies glance at Harrington for direction he had not yet given. "Yes, they are here now," she said quietly, her words measured. "Approximately 30 officers, marked vehicles, full perimeter." Harrington's jaw shifted slightly, a subtle change that betrayed the first hint of uncertainty, not fear, but something closer to irritation at a situation that was no longer entirely within his control, and he took a step forward, boots pressing into the gravel with a crunch that echoed louder than it should have. "Ma'am, you need to end that call and comply," he said, the authority in his voice sharpened just enough to remind everyone present who was supposed to be in charge. But Naomi did not lower the phone, did not rush to respond, her gaze steady as the voice on the other end spoke again. Lower now, more focused, asking questions that did not need to be repeated out loud. Inside the house, a soft cough drifted faintly from down the hallway. Fragile, human, and Naomi's eyes flickered for just a moment toward the doorway behind her before returning to Harrington, that single glance carrying more meaning than any explanation she could have given. She shifted her weight slightly, not backing down, not stepping forward, simply standing exactly where she had chosen to stand. And in that stillness, something changed in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the pressure before a storm that had not yet broken. "Understood," she said into the phone, her voice calm, grounded. "I will remain here." A pause followed, longer this time, and Naomi listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged even as one of the patrol car radios crackled faintly in the distance, a burst of static cutting through the night before fading again. Harrington glanced briefly toward the nearest unit, then back at Naomi, his eyes narrowing as if trying to solve a problem that refused to present itself clearly, and behind him, the line of officers held their positions, but the certainty that had defined their arrival had begun to thin, replaced by something quieter, less certain, a question none of them had voiced yet. Naomi ended the call without ceremony, lowering the phone slowly to her side, her fingers resting lightly against it as if it were just another object, just another tool, and she looked at Harrington again, not with defiance, not with fear, but with the same steady awareness she had carried from the beginning. "You might want to wait," she said, her voice even, almost gentle, and for the first time since the lights had filled the street, no one moved immediately in response. No one gave the order, but the movement slowed anyway, like something unseen had pressed pause on the entire scene, and Sheriff Luke Harrington felt it before he could explain it. A shift so slight, it could have been dismissed if not for the way his instincts refused to ignore it. He had built his reputation on certainty, on walking into situations and controlling them before they had the chance to unfold, and yet standing there under the wash of his own department's lights. He found himself studying Naomi Carter more carefully than he had a moment before, not as a resident, not as a problem to be handled, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "Wait for what?" he asked, his tone still firm but no longer as absolute, the question slipping out before he could stop it, and the deputy closest to him glanced sideways, catching the subtle change that most would have missed. Naomi did not answer right away. She stood there with the same stillness she had held from the beginning, the kind that did not come from stubbornness but from experience, from knowing when speaking too soon only gave away ground you could not afford to lose. The porch light above her flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft glow across her face that contrasted sharply with the harsh red and blue sweeping over everything else. And for a moment, she looked completely separate from the chaos surrounding her, as if she belonged to a different rhythm entirely. Harrington took another step forward, closing part of the distance between them, his boots scraping lightly against the gravel, and behind him, one of the patrol radios crackled again, this time louder, a burst of static followed by a voice that cut off mid-sentence, replaced by silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. "Check your channel," one of the deputies muttered under his breath, lifting a hand to his shoulder mic, pressing it once, then again, his brow tightening when nothing came through clearly. Another officer tried the same, adjusting the dial, tapping the device as if it were malfunctioning, but the result was the same, fragmented sound, incomplete transmission, like something was interrupting the flow without fully revealing itself. Harrington's attention snapped briefly toward the nearest cruiser, where the dashboard radio flickered with intermittent light, then back to Naomi, and for the first time, the equation in his mind no longer balanced the way it had when he arrived. "Ma'am," he said again, slower now, more deliberate. "If you have information that concerns this situation, you need to provide it immediately." Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, as if she had heard that tone before in a different place, under different circumstances, where the stakes had been measured in ways most people never had to consider. "I already did," she replied, her voice calm, even, the words landing without force but carrying weight all the same, and the deputy beside Harrington shifted again, this time more noticeably, his gaze moving from Naomi to the line of patrol cars, then back, as if trying to understand something that had not yet fully revealed itself. A faint breeze moved through the yard, brushing against the grass, rustling the leaves of a small tree near the sidewalk, and in that quiet movement, Naomi's sweatshirt shifted just enough to reveal the edge of something metallic at the collar, not bright, not obvious, just a brief glint that caught the light before settling back in a shadow, unnoticed by most, but not by Harrington, whose eyes lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. He did not speak immediately after that. The certainty that had guided every decision he made that night was still there, but it was no longer alone, now sharing space with something else, something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous to ignore. Behind him, the officers remained in position, but the formation had loosened, not by command, but by instinct, the invisible thread of confidence that held it together beginning to fray at the edges. Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the start, the door to her home just behind her, the night stretched wide in front of her, and the distance between her and the line of authority no longer felt as fixed as it had when the first cruiser pulled up. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something recalibrating beneath the surface, and Sheriff Luke Harrington felt the weight of it settle into his chest as he reached for his radio again, pressing the transmit button with more force than necessary. His voice steady, but edged now with urgency, he did not bother to hide. "Dispatch, confirm status," he said, waiting, listening, the seconds stretching longer than they should have, until a response finally came through, but it was not the familiar voice he expected, not the routine acknowledgement that usually followed without question. Instead, the reply was clipped, formal, and carried a tone that did not belong to local coordination. "All units stand by for updated directive," the voice said, precise and controlled, and then the line went quiet again, leaving behind a kind of silence that felt heavier than the earlier static. Harrington lowered the radio slowly, his eyes lifting back to Naomi Carter, who had not moved, not even an inch, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that no longer felt passive, but deliberate, as if she had stepped into a space she understood far better than anyone else standing in that yard. One of the deputies took a half step closer to Harrington, leaning in just enough to keep his voice low. "Sir, that did not come from our channel," he said, the words careful, measured, and Harrington gave a slight nod without looking away from Naomi, his mind already moving through possibilities he did not like, each one pointing toward a conclusion he had not prepared for. "Ma'am," Harrington said again, but this time the word carried less command and more calculation, as if he were choosing each syllable with greater care. "I need you to explain what is happening." Naomi's gaze softened just slightly, not with sympathy, but with recognition, as if she had seen this exact moment before, the instant when authority begins to question itself. when certainty gives way to something far less comfortable. "I already told you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "There has been a mistake." The words landed differently now, no longer easy to dismiss, no longer just a line spoken by someone outnumbered, but something that had begun to take shape in the air around them. Another radio crackled, this time from a cruiser further down the line, and an officer turned toward it instinctively, his hand hovering over the door as if unsure whether to step away or stay where he was. The flashing lights continued their relentless cycle, but the energy behind them had changed, the urgency replaced by hesitation, by a growing awareness that something larger than their initial purpose was unfolding in real time. Harrington drew in a slow breath, the cool night air sharp in his lungs, and for the first time since arriving, he glanced past Naomi, toward the open doorway of her home, where the soft interior light still glowed, warm and steady, untouched by the chaos outside. That light did not belong to conflict. It belonged to care, to routine, to a life that had been interrupted by something that no longer felt justified in the way it once had. He looked back at her, really looked this time, not at her stance or her words, but at the quiet confidence that had never wavered, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a man beginning to realize he had stepped into a situation he did not fully understand. Naomi lowered her hand slightly, the phone still resting in her palm, and though she did not speak again, the message was clear in the space between them, in the stillness she maintained, in the absence of fear where fear should have been. Somewhere in the distance, another engine shut off, the low hum fading into silence, and one by one, without instruction, the officers began to adjust their stance, not retreating, not advancing, just waiting, as if the next move no longer belonged to them. The stillness stretched longer than anyone expected, and in that stretch, discomfort began to take shape, quiet but undeniable, settling into the shoulders of officers who had arrived certain of their purpose and now found themselves standing in a moment that refused to move forward the way it should have. Sheriff Luke Harrington adjusted his stance, the gravel shifting under his boots as he scanned the line of patrol cars, then the faces of his deputies, then back to Naomi Carter, as if trying to anchor himself to something that still made sense. "We are not leaving without answers," he said finally, his voice firm again. But there was something underneath it now, something tighter, less secure, like a man holding on to authority by habit rather than certainty. Naomi did not react to the tone. She had heard it before, in different rooms, in different uniforms, in situations where control had always seemed absolute right up until the moment it was not. "You already have what you need," she replied, her voice steady, her words simple, but carrying a quiet finality that did not invite argument. A deputy near the far end of the line stepped closer to his cruiser, opening the driver's side door halfway, as his radio suddenly emitted a sharp burst of sound, louder than before, clear enough now that several officers turned toward it at once. The voice that followed was not local, not familiar, and not casual. It was structured, precise, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to raise itself to be understood. "All units on scene, stand down and hold position," the voice said, each word measured, leaving no room for interpretation. The deputy froze with his hand still on the door, his eyes lifting toward Harrington, waiting, because that was what they always did. They waited for his confirmation, his command, his reinforcement of what they were hearing. Harrington did not respond immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on Naomi, and in that moment, something settled into place, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to shift the balance he had been trying to maintain. "Repeat that," he said into his own radio, his voice controlled, but the request came slower this time, as if he already knew the answer would not change. The response came back even clearer. "Stand down. Federal directive. Await further instruction." A faint ripple moved through the line of officers, not panic, not disorder, just a shared recognition that the situation had crossed into a space none of them had anticipated when they first pulled up onto this quiet street. One of the deputies lowered his hand from his shoulder mic, his posture loosening just slightly, while another glanced back toward the far end of the block, as if expecting something else to arrive, something that would explain what they were now being told to accept. Naomi remained where she was, her presence unchanged, her calm no longer just a personal trait, but something that seemed to define the moment itself, anchoring it, holding it steady while everything around her adjusted. Harrington exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, and for the first time since stepping onto the property, he did not issue an immediate order. Instead, he looked at Naomi with a level of attention that bordered on respect, though he would not have named it that yet. And when he spoke again, the edge in his voice had softened into something more measured. "What did you do?" he asked, not accusing, not demanding, but genuinely needing to understand. Naomi's eyes met his, steady, unshaken, and for a moment, the flashing lights seemed to fade behind her, the noise of engines and radios falling into the background. "I made sure the right people were aware," she said quietly. And that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement that carried more weight than anything else spoken that night. Somewhere down the line, another engine turned off, then another, the low hum of the scene gradually dimming, not because anyone had told it to, but because the need for it had begun to dissolve, replaced by something else, something quieter, something that no longer belonged to control but to consequence. The change did not arrive with sirens or flashing lights. It came in the absence of them, in the way the street slowly exhaled as engines powered down one by one, the low mechanical hum dissolving into a quiet that felt almost unfamiliar. After the intensity that had filled it just minutes before, and Naomi Carter remained on the porch, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment while everyone else was still catching up to it. The red and blue reflections that had once dominated the scene now flickered more faintly across the windows of nearby houses, their rhythm losing urgency, becoming background instead of command, and in that softened light, the details of the night returned, the faint chirp of insects, the distant sound of a car passing several blocks away, the ordinary world slowly reclaiming space. Sheriff Luke Harrington lowered his radio to his side, his grip loosening without him realizing it, the weight of the device suddenly feeling different in his hand, no longer an extension of immediate authority, but something waiting for instruction from somewhere beyond him, and that realization settled in quietly, without announcement, but with undeniable presence. He looked at Naomi again, not with challenge now, not with suspicion, but with a kind of measured attention that suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a subject of a call, not as a resident in a situation, but as someone who had never actually lost control of this moment, even when it appeared she had none. Naomi shifted slightly, just enough to rest her shoulder against the doorframe, the wood cool beneath her arm, grounding her in the simple reality of her home, and for a brief second, her gaze drifted inward, past the threshold, toward the soft glow that still illuminated the hallway inside, where quiet responsibility waited, where the night had always been about care rather than conflict. A gentle sound carried from within, a subtle movement, a presence that reminded her why she had remained exactly where she was, why she had not stepped back, why she had not raised her voice, and when her eyes returned to the yard, they carried that same calm resolve, unchanged, unwavering. Harrington took a slow breath, the air cooler now, sharper, and for the first time, he seemed to measure his next words not by instinct, but by consideration. "If this is federal," he said, more to himself than to her, though the words were clearly meant to be heard, "then we were not informed." The statement hung there, incomplete, an acknowledgement rather than an accusation, and Naomi did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to do what it had been doing all along, revealing more than any explanation could. One of the deputies stepped back toward his cruiser, closing the door he had left open earlier with a soft click, the sound small but significant, like a decision made without needing to be announced, and another officer removed his hand from his radio, letting it fall to his side, his posture easing in a way that suggested the tension had nowhere left to go. Naomi looked at Harrington, her expression steady, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly across the space between them. "Not everything is meant to be announced ahead of time," she said, the words simple, but layered with meaning that extended beyond the immediate moment, and Harrington's eyes held hers for a second longer than before, absorbing not just the statement, but the truth behind it. The porch light above her cast a soft halo that did not flicker now, steady and warm, and in that light, The contrast between the house and the street became more pronounced, one grounded in care and continuity, the other slowly releasing its grip on control. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in quiet reflection, then lifted it again, her presence as composed as it had been from the start. And around her, the night continued to settle, the tension dissolving into something quieter, something that felt less like an ending and more like a shift that no one there would fully forget. The confirmation did not come with spectacle. It came with clarity, sharp and undeniable, cutting clean through the last threads of uncertainty that still lingered in the air, and it began with a single transmission that no one on that street could ignore. Every active radio, every unit, every frequency shifted at once, not with static this time, but with precision, as a new voice replaced the fragmented signals that had come before, a voice that carried authority without needing to declare it, calm, controlled, and unmistakably higher than anything they had been operating under. All local units on scene, this is Federal Command. You are instructed to disengage immediately and vacate the perimeter. This operation is now under federal jurisdiction. The words landed across the line of officers like a quiet shock. Not loud, not chaotic, but absolute. And for a moment, no one moved, not because they had not heard, but because they were recalibrating, adjusting to a reality that had shifted faster than their instincts could follow. Sheriff Luke Harrington stood still, the radio in his hand suddenly heavier than it had been all night, his jaw tightening as the meaning of the message settled in fully, leaving no room for interpretation, no space for negotiation, and when the voice continued, it did so with a level of specificity that erased any remaining doubt. Sheriff Harrington, you are to stand down your personnel and await formal review. Further details will be provided through official channels. His name, spoken clearly, directly, in a tone that did not ask but informed, drew the attention of every deputy within earshot, and several of them turned toward him instinctively, not for instruction this time, but for confirmation that what they had just heard was real. Harrington did not respond immediately. His gaze moved slowly back to Naomi Carter, and in that moment, everything aligned, the call she had made, the calm she had held, the certainty she had never abandoned, all of it forming a picture that was no longer incomplete. Naomi met his eyes without hesitation, her expression unchanged, not triumphant, not vindictive, just steady, as if this outcome had always been inevitable. A faint breeze passed through the yard again, softer now, carrying away the last remnants of tension that had defined the night, and one by one, the officers began to move, not in urgency, not in resistance, but in quiet compliance, doors closing, engines remaining off, radios lowering to their sides as the structure that had brought them here dissolved without protest. Harrington exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more weight than any order he had given that night, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, measured, stripped of the authority that had once defined it. You could have said all of this from the beginning, he said, though the statement held more reflection than accusation, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering the words before answering. I did, she replied, her voice calm. You just were not ready to hear it. The truth in that response settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, and Harrington looked away for a brief moment, his eyes moving across the street that now felt different from when he had first stepped onto it, less like a scene to control and more like a place he had misunderstood. Naomi remained on the porch, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, the soft light behind her unchanged, and as the last of the radios fell silent, the moment reached its turning point, not with force, not with spectacle, but with the simple, undeniable realization that power had shifted, and it had done so without her ever needing to raise her voice. The shift from command to consequence did not come with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It came in the way Sheriff Luke Harrington lowered his gaze for just a moment longer than before, the silence between him and Naomi Carter stretching into something heavier, something that carried the quiet weight of realization rather than resistance. Around them, the scene continued to unwind, officers moving with subdued efficiency, closing doors, stepping back toward their vehicles without urgency, as if the purpose that had driven them there had dissolved and left behind only procedure. The flashing lights, once sharp and commanding, now felt almost out of place. Their rhythm no longer matched to the mood of the street, and one by one, they began to dim as units powered down systems that were no longer needed. Harrington took a step closer to the porch, not to assert control, but to close a distance that no longer felt defined by authority, his posture straighter, but his presence quieter, as if something in him had recalibrated. "Miss Carter," he said, using her name for the first time with a tone that carried acknowledgement rather than assumption, and Naomi looked at him steadily, her expression unchanged, her calm no longer just composure, but something deeper, something earned. "What happened here tonight?" he continued, choosing his words carefully. "It should not have unfolded this way." The admission did not come easily, but it came clearly, and that alone shifted the air between them in a way no command ever could. Naomi listened without interruption, her hand still resting lightly against the doorframe, the soft light from inside her home outlining her figure against the dark, grounding her in a space that had never belonged to the chaos outside. "No, it should not have," she replied, her voice even, not sharp, not accusing, just honest, and the simplicity of it carried more impact than anything louder would have. Harrington nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate, and for a moment, he looked past her again, toward the interior of the house, where the quiet glow remained steady, untouched by everything that had just happened. "We acted on incomplete information," he said, though the words felt insufficient even as he spoke them, and Naomi's gaze held his, steady, unwavering. "You acted on assumptions," she said softly, not to correct him, but to clarify something that mattered more than phrasing, and Harrington's jaw tightened slightly before relaxing again, the truth of that distinction settling in whether he wanted it to or not. A deputy approached from behind him, stopping just short of interrupting, waiting until Harrington acknowledged him with a slight turn of the head. "Sir, units are clearing the block," the deputy said quietly, and Harrington gave a brief nod, his attention returning to Naomi almost immediately. "There will be a report," he said, more formally now, though the edge of authority had softened into something more reflective, "and I will make sure it reflects what actually occurred." Naomi considered that for a moment, her expression thoughtful but composed, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet strength it had from the beginning. "Make sure it reflects why it occurred," she said, the words landing with precision, not as a demand, but as a standard, and Harrington held her gaze for a second longer before nodding again, this time slower, more deliberate. The last of the engines along the street powered down, leaving behind a quiet that felt earned rather than empty, and as officers returned to their vehicles, the formation that had once filled the block dissolved completely, leaving only scattered movement where there had once been control. Naomi shifted slightly, turning just enough toward the doorway behind her, the light inside steady, familiar, waiting, and when she looked back at Harrington one last time, there was no triumph in her expression, no sense of victory, only the same calm presence that had carried her through the entire night. Harrington stepped back, giving her space without needing to be told, and in that simple motion, something unspoken passed between them, not forgiveness, not resolution, but recognition, the kind that does not need to be explained to be understood. The last patrol car rolled forward. Slowly, its tires pressing softly against the pavement as it turned at the end of the block and disappeared beyond the corner, and with it, the final trace of urgency left the street, replaced by a stillness that felt deeper than silence, something settled, something restored. Naomi Carter remained on the porch for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, her eyes following the fading glow of red and blue until it dissolved completely into the dark, and when it did, the night returned fully, unbroken, as if it had been waiting patiently for everything else to pass. The air felt different now, cooler, calmer, carrying the faint scent of rain that still had not fallen, and the small sounds of the neighborhood began to surface again, a distant wind moving through trees, the quiet hum of a house settling, the ordinary rhythm of a place that had nothing left to prove. Sheriff Luke Harrington stood at the edge of the yard for a moment after the others had gone, his silhouette no longer framed by flashing lights, just a man standing in the quiet aftermath of a decision he could not undo, and when he finally turned, he did so without looking back, his steps measured, his posture steady, but changed in a way that did not need explanation. Naomi watched him leave without expression, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing left to say, no final word that would add meaning to what had already unfolded. And as his figure disappeared into the distance, she exhaled slowly, a breath that carried the weight of the entire night, and released it without sound. She stepped back inside, the wooden floor cool beneath her feet, the door closing gently behind her with a soft click that echoed just enough to mark the shift from outside to within, from confrontation to care. The light inside the house wrapped around her immediately, warm and steady, unchanged by everything that had happened beyond its walls. And as she moved down the hallway, her steps quiet, deliberate, the purpose that had guided her from the beginning returned fully to the surface, grounding her in something far more important than the events of the night. A figure rested in the next room, breathing evenly, undisturbed, the kind of peace that had been protected not by force, but by presence, by the quiet strength that had never wavered even when it stood alone. Naomi paused at the doorway, her hand resting against the frame for a moment as she watched, her expression softening just slightly, not in relief, but in recognition of what had always mattered most. And then she stepped inside, adjusting a blanket, smoothing a corner, small movements that carried more meaning than anything spoken outside ever could. Behind her, the house settled into its natural quiet, the faint creak of wood, the soft hum of electricity, the steady rhythm of a place that held life in its simplest form. And outside, the street remained still, no lights, no engines, no voices, just the lingering presence of a moment that had passed and left something behind. Naomi moved back toward the kitchen, her hands steady as she filled a glass with water, the sound of it pouring clear and uninterrupted. And when she set it down on the counter, she stood there for a second, her reflection faint in the dark window, the outline of her figure framed by the soft light behind her. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply stood, breathing evenly, her presence calm, grounded, unchanged. And in that quiet, in that stillness, the weight of everything that had happened settled into something simple and undeniable, not power, not victory, but the quiet certainty that she had never needed either to stand exactly where she belonged.